How's it going, everybody? My name is Max, and this is the Republic of Philosophy. Today, I'm going to be reading The History of Madness by Michel Foucault. This is the Routledge edition, and The History of Madness is a very, very important book for Foucault. It's probably the one of, if not the most important book, along with Discipline and Punish and the History of Sexuality, Volume 1. This is translated by Jonathan Murphy and Jean Khalifa. Okay. Part 1, Chapter 1. Stultifera Navis. Stultifera Navis. At the end of the Middle Ages, leprosy disappeared from the Western world. At the edges of the community, at town gates, large, barren, uninhabitable areas appeared, where the disease no longer reigned, but its ghost still hovered. For centuries, these spaces would belong to the domain of the inhuman. From the 14th to the 17th century, by means of strange incantations, they conjured up a new incarnation of evil, another grinning mask of fear, home to the constantly renewed magic of purification and exclusion. From the High Middle Ages until the end of the Crusades, leprosia had sprung up and multiplied across the surface of Europe. The exact figure is unknown, but according to Matthew Paris, there were some 19,000 of these cities of the damned spread throughout Christendom. In the years leading up to 1266, when Louis ordered a set of statues to be drawn up for the Lazare houses, there were more than 2,000 such institutions in France. They numbered 43 in one diocese in Paris alone, Bourg-la-Reine, Cobel, Saint-Valère, and the sinister Camp Bury, Rotten Row. All figure on the list. Chatterton, a name that would resonate down the centuries, is there too. The two largest houses, Saint-Germain and Saint-Lazare, were on the immediate outskirts of Paris, and their names too will crop up in the history of another sickness. From the turn of the 15th century, a new emptiness appears. Saint-Germain becomes a home for young offenders. The following century, and before Saint Vincent, Saint-Lazare counted only one leper, Le Soeur Langros, a practitioner in the civil court. The leprosorium of Nancy, which had been one of the largest in Europe, had only 4 inmates during the regency of Maire de Médicis. The memories of Catel recount that there were 29 hospitals in Toulouse at the end of the medieval period, 7 of which were leprosia. But at the beginning of the 17th century, the number had shrunk to 3: Saint Cyprien, Arnold, Bernard, and Saint Michel. Festivities were widespread to celebrate the disappearance of leprosy. In 1635, for instance, the inhabitants of Reims proceeded solemnly to thank God for delivering their town from this plight. By that time, the French crown had already been reorganizing the immense fortune the lepers' houses' lands represented for more than a century. Francois I had ordered a census and an inventory of all such institutions on the 19th of December, 1543, to put an end to the great disorder apparent in leper houses. And in his turn, Henry VI decreed that 1606 that the accounts of such institutions be revised, and that revenue accruing from this review be used for the upkeep of poor gentlemen and invalid soldiers. Another such review was ordered on the 24th of October 1612, with the idea that this time the surplus revenue be used to feed the poor. In fact, the leprosia question wouldn't be settled in France before the close of the 17th century, and the economic importance of the question would be at the base of many conflict. In 1677, there were still 44 leprosia in the province of Dauphin alone. On the 20th of February, 1672, Louis transferred control of all military and hospital orders to the orders of Saint Lazare and Mont Carmel, which were entrusted with the administration of all the remaining leprosia in the kingdom. Years later, the 1672 edict was revoked, and by means of series of measures that came into force from March 1693 to July 1695, the goods of the leper houses were redistributed among other hospitals and institutions for the succoring of the afflicted. The few lepers who still inhabited the 1,200 leprosy that remained were grouped together in Saint-Maximin near Orleans. These new orders were first brought into force in Paris, where Parliament transferred the revenue in question to the Hospital Général, and the example was soon being followed in the provinces. In Toulouse, all leprosy possessions were redirected to the hospital for incurables. In 1696, revenue from Beaulieu in Normandy was transferred to the main hospital in Caen, and in Volly, the money was transferred to the Saint Foy Hospital. Together with Saint-Maximin, only Les Gans near Bordeaux retained its former status. For their 1.5 million inhabitants in the 12th century, England and Scotland had opened 222 leper houses. But even by the 14th century, they were beginning to empty. When Edward III ordered an inquiry into the state of Ripion Hospital in 1342, it emerged that there were no lepers, and the foundation was charged with the care of the poor instead. By 1434, in the hospital founded in the late 12th century by Archbishop Pucel, there were only 2 remaining beds reserved for lepers, and they were often unoccupied. In 1348, the great leper house of St. Alban had only 3 inhabitants. Rumnel Hospital in Kent was abandoned 24 years later, as no more lepers could be found. In Chatham, the St. Bartholomew St. Bartholomew House, founded in 1078, had been one of the biggest in the country. By the time the Queen of Elizabeth, it had only 2 inmates, and it was finally closed altogether in 1627. The same regression of the disease was witnessed in Germany, although the process was slightly slower. As in England, the Reformation hastened the transfer of control of the leper houses to local city authorities, who converted them into houses for the poor or hospitals, as was the case in Leipzig, Munich, and Hamburg. In 1542, all possessions of the leper house of Schleswig-Holstein were handed over to the hospitals. In Stuttgart, a magistrate's report indicated in 1589 that no leper had been recorded in the city Lazare house for more than 50 years. In Lippenling, the Lazare house was peopled with the insane and the incurably ill from an early age. This strange disappearance was probably not the long sought after result of obscure medical practices, but rather a spontaneous result of segregation and the consequence with the coming of the end of the Crusades, of cutting the course that led to the main source of infection in the Middle East. Leprosy had retreated, and lowly spaces set aside for it, together with the rituals that had grown up not to suppress it, but to keep it at a sacred distance, suddenly had no purpose. But what lasted longer than leprosy and persisted for years after the Lazare house had been emptied, where the values and images attached to the leper and the importance for society of this insistent, fearsome figure who was carefully excluded only after a sacred circle had been drawn around him. If lepers were socially excluded and removed from the community of the visible church, their existence still made God manifest, as they showed both his anger and his bounty. Dearly beloved, says a ritual from the church in Vienna, in the south of France. It has pleased God to afflict you with this disease, and the Lord is gracious for bringing punishment upon you for the evil that you have done in this world. And as he was dragged out of the church by the priest and his acolytes, Cresu retrogrado, the leper was assured that he was God's witness. However removed from the church and the company of the healthy, you are never separated from the grace of God. Bruegel's lepers watch from afar, but forever, as Christ climbs Mount Calvary, accompanied by a whole people, heretic witnesses of evil, their salvation is assured by their exclusion. In a strange reversal, quite opposed to merit and prayers, they are saved by the hand that is not offered. The sinner who abandons the leper to his fate thereby opens the door to salvation. Thus be patient in your sickness, for the Lord does not underestimate your ills, nor separate you from his company. If you have patience, you will be saved, like the leper who died outside the door of the rich man and was carried straight to heaven. Abandonment is his salvation, and exclusion offers a different form of communion. Once leprosy had gone, and the figure of the leper was no more than a distant memory, these structures still remained. The game of exclusion would be played again, often in these same places. In an oddly similar fashion, 2 or 3 centuries later, the role of the leper was to be played by the poor and by the vagrant, by prisoners and by the alienated, and the sort of salvation at stake for both parties in his game of exclusion is the matter of the study. The forms this exclusion took would continue in a radically different culture and with a new meaning, but remaining essentially the major form of a rigorous division, at the same time social exclusion and spiritual reintegration. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The role that leprosy had played was first taken by venereal disease, venereal disease. Such diseases were the natural heir to leprosy in the late 15th century, and the disease was treated in several leper hospitals. Under Francois I, an attempt was made to confine it to the hospital of the parish of Saint Eustache, and then to the parish of Saint Nicholas, both of which had served as Lazar houses. Twice more under Charles VIII, and again in 1559, various buildings and outhouses at Saint-Germain-des-Prés, previously used for lepers, were converted for venereal diseases. Soon the disease was so common that the construction of special buildings was being considered in certain spacious areas in towns and suburbs segregated from passers-by. A new leprosy was born, which took the place of the former, but not without difficulty or conflicts. For lepers too have their fears. Lepers were far from overjoyed at being forced to share their space with the newcomers to the world of horror. This astonishing and contagious disease is much to be feared. Even the lepers themselves reject it in horror and refuse to permit those who have contracted the disease to keep their company. But despite their long-standing right to say in these segregated areas, there were too few of them to make their voices heard, and the venereal, more or less everywhere, had soon taken their place. In the classic age, it was not venereal disease that would take over the role of the leprosy had played in the medieval culture. Despite these initial measures of exclusion, venereal disease was soon classed as simply another disease once more. And despite the reservations of the population, sufferers were soon being treated in hospitals. They were taken to the Hotel des Dieux in Paris, and despite several attempts to expel him, they soon blended in with the other sick. In Germany, special houses were built for them not to ensure their exclusion, but so that appropriate treatment could be given. And the Fuggers in Augsburg set up 2 such hospitals. The city of Nuremberg appointed a special physician who claimed to be able to control the French malady. The major difference with leprosy was that venereal disease became a medical affair very early on, to be dealt with exclusively by doctors. Treatment sprang up on all sides. The order of Saint Come followed the Arab example and used mercury, whereas in the Hotel Dieu in Paris, treatment relied mainly on theriac. Then came the great vogue for Giac, more precious than American gold. If Ulrich von Hutten and Fra Castor Syphides are to be believed, sweat cures were practiced everywhere. In the course of the 16th century, venereal disease took their place among other ills requiring medical treatment. The place of the venereal diseases was fixed in a whole network of moral judgments, but that horizon brought only minor modifications to the essentially medical apprehension of the disease. Curiously, it was not only under the influence of the world of confinement. In the 17th century, that venereal disease became detached to some extent from this medical context, and like madness, entered a space of social and moral exclusion. It is not in venereal disease that the true heir of leprosy should be sought, but in a highly complex phenomenon that medicine would take for longer to appropriate. That phenomenon is madness, but only after a long leniency period of almost 2 centuries did that new obsession take the place of fear that leprosy had instilled in the masses and elicit similar reaction of division, expulsion, purification, which are kin to madness itself. But before madness was brought under control towards the mid-17th century and before ancient rituals were resuscitated in its honor, it was linked ostensibly to many of the major experiences of the Renaissance. A brief overview of this presents and some of the essential figures are now in order. The simplest of these figures is almost the most symbolic. A new object made its appearance in the imaginary landscape of the Renaissance, and it was not long before it occupied a privileged place there. This was the ship of fools, a strange drunken boat that wound its way down the wide, slow-moving rivers of the Rhineland and around the Canal of Flanders. This Narrenschrift was clearly a literary invention and was probably borrowed from the ancient cycle of Aigronos that had recently been given a new lease of life among mythological themes, and in the case of Burgundy, at least now had an institutional function. Such ships were literarily commonplace. Such ships were literary commonplace, with a crew of imaginary heroes, moral models, or carefully defined social types who set out on a great symbolic voyage that brought them, if not fortune, at the very least, the figure of their destiny or their truth. Siphorin Champère, for example, composed successfully a ship of princes and battles of the nobility in 1502, and a ship of virtuous ladies the following year. There is also a ship of health, together with Jacob van Oostvoren, Blauschoute, in 1413, Brand's Narrenschrift in 1497, and Jose Bade's Faturum Mulerium of 1498. Naturally, Bosch's paintings belongs to this same honorific flotilla. But among these satirical and novelistic ships, the Narrenschrift alone had a genuine existence, for they really did exist, these boats that drifted from one town to another with their senseless cargo. An itinerant existence was often the lot of the mad. It was common practice for towns to banish them from inside their city walls, leaving them to run wild in the distant countryside, or entrusting them to the care of traveling merchants or pilgrims. The custom was not common in Germany. In Nuremberg, during the first half of the 15th century, in the presence of 62 madmen was recorded, and 31 were chased out of town. There were 31 more enforced departures over the 50 years that followed, and this was merely for madmen arrested by the municipal authorities. They were often entrusted to the care of their river boatmen. In Frankfurt in 1399, boatmen were given the task of ridding the city of a madman who walked around naked. And in the earliest years of the following century, a criminal madman was expelled in the same manner from Mainz. Sometimes the boatmen put these difficult passengers back ashore earlier than they had promised. One Frankfurt blacksmith returned twice from being expelled in such manner before being definitively escorted to Kreuznach. The arrival of the great cities of Europe of these ship of fools must have been quite a common sight. It is hard to pin down the precise meaning of the practice. It is tempting to think of it as a general means of expulsion used by the municipalities to punish vagabondage among the mad. But that hypothesis doesn't quite fit the facts, as this was a fate that only befell certain madmen, as some were treated in hospitals even before the construction of special houses for the insane began. In Hôtel Dieu in Paris, they had specifically allocated bunks in some dormitories reserved for them. And in the most of the general cities in Europe throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, there was always a special place reserved for the detention of the insane, like Milan Châtelet, or the famous Tour au Fou Quin. In Germany, there were countless Nartumori, like the gates of Lübeck or the Hamburgian Jungfer. So the mad were not systematically run out of town. It could be argued that only foreign madmen were expelled, and that each town only took responsibility for its own citizens who had lost their own wits. And indeed, in the accounts of various medieval cities, there are records of funds put aside for the mad and donations made in favor of the insane. But the problem is not so simple, for there were centuries where the insane, more numerous than anywhere else, were initially not indigenous. To the fore here were centuries of pilgrimage, like Saint Mathurin de Lanchpant, Saint Hildevort de Gournay, Besancon, and Gille. Such trips were organized and even paid for by cities and hospitals. And it may be that these trips of ships of fools, which haunted the imagination of the early Renaissance, were in fact ships of pilgrimage, highly symbolic ships filled with the senseless in search of their reason. Some went down to the rivers of the Rhineland towards Belgium and Gille, while others went up to the Rhine, to Besancon and Jura. But there were other towns like Nuremberg, which were certainly not places pilgrimage, yet which contained a higher than average number of madmen, far more than the city itself could have furnished. These madmen were lodged and paid for out of the city coffers, but were not cared for. They were simply thrown into prison. It may be the case that in some big cities where there were markets and many people who came and went, the madmen were brought in considerable numbers by merchants and riverboatmen, and that there they were forgotten, thereby cleansing their hometown of their presence. Perhaps these places of counter-pilgrimage became focused with places where the insane really were taking this pilgrimage, the pilgrims. The concern with cure and exclusion fused with the sacred space of the miraculous. It is possible that the town of Geel developed in his summer a place of pilgrimage that became a Geel development in this manner. A place of pilgrimage that became a place of confinement, a holy land where madness awaited its deliverance, but where it seems that men enacted an ancient ritual of division. The constant circulation of the insane, the gesture of banishment and enforced embarkation, was not merely aimed at social utility or the safety of citizens. Its meanings were closer to rituals and their trace still discernible. So it was, for instance, that the insane were barred entry to churches, while ecclesiastical law allowed them to partake of the sacraments. The church took no sanctions against priests who, of the sacraments, the church took no sanctions against priests who lost their reason. But in Nuremberg in 1421, a mad priest was expelled with particular solemnity, as though the impurity was multiplied by the sacred nature of the character. Yet the town paid the money that was to serve as his vicatactum. On occasions, the insane were publicly whipped and, in a sort of simulated hunt, were chased out of the town while being beaten with sticks, all of which indicates that the departure of the mad belonged with other rituals of exile. So the ship of fools was heavily loaded with meaning and clearly carried a great social force. On the other hand, it has incontestably practical functions, as entrusting a madman to the care of the boatmen meant that he would no longer roam around the city walls, and ensured that he would travel far and be a prisoner of his own departure. There was no more water brought, but there was more. Where water brought its own dark symbolic charge, carrying away but purifying too. Navigation brought man face to face with the uncertainty of his destiny. Where each is left to himself, and every departure might always be the last. The madman on his crazy boat sets sail for the other world, and it is from the other world that he comes to be, that he comes from the other world when he disembarks. This enforced navigation is both rigorous division and absolute passage, serving to undermine, in real and imaginary terms, the limit situation of the mad in medieval society. It was a highly symbolic role made clear by the mental geographic involved, where the madman was confined at the gates of the cities. His exclusion was his confinement, and if he had no prison other than that, this threshold, he was still detained in his place of passage. In a highly symbolic position, he is placed on the inside of the outside, or vice versa, a posture that still is today. If we admit that what was once the visible fortress of Europe, order is now the castle of our own consciousness. Water and navigation had played a role, or had a role to play. Locked in the ship from which he could not escape, the madman was handed over to the thousand-armed river to the sea where all paths crossed, and the great uncertainty of surrounding all things. A prisoner in the midst of the failure of freedom on the most open road of all, claimed solidly to the infinite crossroads. He is the passenger par excellence, the prisoner of the past, the prisoner of the passage. It is not known where he will land and when he lands. He knows not whence he came. His truth, his home, are the barren wasteland between two lands that can never be his own. Perhaps this ritual lies in the origin of the imaginary kingship common throughout the culture of the West, or perhaps it was this kinship that called for and then fixed the ritual of embarkation, whose origins are lost in the midst of civilization. But one thing is certain: the link between water and madness is deeply rooted in the dream of the Western man. So that's basically up to page 11, and then I will read rest of History of Madness in the next few days. Feel free to leave a comment if you have any thoughts on what we read, if you're reading along, and let me know what you think. See you later. See you next time, guys.